And that was a little later too, which I think is a natural thing. Suddenly we've got lives. And
Ringo Starr never walked into the Beatles as a fourth brother. He walked in as the replacement everyone thought was disposable. He kept smiling under the stage lights while headlines mocked him as the luckiest drummer alive, and insiders quietly questioned whether he truly belonged. Even inside the band, one bandmate treated him like a hired hand, and a calculating outsider turned their brotherhood into betrayal. Now, after decades of silence, Ringo has finally revealed the names he could never forgive. And trust me, you won't believe who's on that list. The past that made the Beatles reject Ringo. Ringo's anger didn't begin in Abbey Road. It began in a hospital bed. As a child in wartime Liverpool, Richard Starkey spent more time sick than in a classroom. First peritonitis, then tuberculosis. He lost years of school, fell behind other kids, and came out of hospital quiet, shy, and with a permanent sense that everyone else knew more than he did. That insecurity mattered later. In the biggest band in the world, he would always feel like the one with the shortest resume. The drums were his escape. In local bands like Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, he wasn't flashy, but he was rock solid. That's why, in 1962, when the Beatles needed a stronger drummer than Pete Best, they called him. He walked into EMI as the upgrade, and within days was humiliated. At the Love Me Do session, producer George Martin brought in session drummer Andy White because he wasn't sure the new guy was good enough. Decades later, Ringo admitted the sting never really faded. I went through hell personally because George Martin had this Andy White session drummer. I made him apologize every day. That's the first crack. He joins as the supposed savior, and the first thing the adults in the room do is quietly replace him on the single. The press didn't help. Headlines joked he could only keep time. Critics called him the least talented Beatle, insisting he was lucky to stand behind Lennon and McCartney. Your first big hit, and the story is, you're only here because of your friends. Inside the band, the hierarchy was obvious. John and Paul wrote the songs. George was the frustrated third genius trying to break through. And Ringo? He sang the novelty songs, played the steady beats, made people laugh. Nothing more. And once Brian Epstein died in 1967 and the band lost its stabilizing manager, that quiet, good-natured drummer suddenly found himself trapped between three powerful egos, and one of them, more than anyone else, made him feel small. Paul McCartney, the workaholic who pushed Ringo out of his own band. If there's one Beatle who consistently tested Ringo's patience, it was Paul McCartney. After Epstein's death, Paul stepped into the leadership vacuum. He wrote relentlessly, organized sessions, and pushed the others back into the studio when they were drifting. Ringo later summed it up brutally simply. Paul always made the phone call. Paul would want us to work all the time because he's the workaholic. It sounds admirable, yet inside the band, it felt like control. Paul wasn't just writing songs. He was telling people how to play them. The breaking point came during the White Album sessions in 1968. Paul, obsessing over tiny details, kept making Ringo redo a simple drum pattern again and again. Finally, McCartney sat at the kit to show him how it should be played. For a drummer who had already been replaced on Love Me Do, that was more than a correction. It was confirmation. You're optional. Then Ringo walked. He left the band and disappeared for about 2 weeks while they struggled on without him. Years later, he still talked about the pain of being treated like a piece of equipment, not a partner. If Paul didn't trust his drumming, what was he even doing there? Paul's perfectionism kept the Beatles' standards sky high, but it also made the others feel like session musicians on their own records. For Ringo, who already carried the stigma of being the replacement and the least talented, having Paul literally take his seat was like watching his worst fear play out in real time. And here's where it gets even more twisted. These two men eventually became each other's last link to the band. In 2015, Paul stood on stage at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and personally inducted Ringo as a solo artist, then joked about inducing him into the hall. In recent years, they've toured together, shared the stage, and McCartney has called their bond very special. Of course, you know what it means, John Lennon and Yoko Ono. The moment Ringo realized his leader was gone. Nothing unsettled Ringo more than watching John Lennon slowly disappear into someone he no longer recognized. For years, John had been the anchor to the band. Ringo always admired him. Even when the others argued, Ringo stood behind John's shoulder like a steady shadow. But in 1968, a shift began, subtle at first, then overwhelming. Yoko Ono didn't just appear beside John. She appeared in the studio, in the creative process, in the conversations, and eventually in the unspoken hierarchy of the group. The Beatles had always operated as a closed circle. 4 voices, 4 opinions. But suddenly there were 5 presences in the room, and only one of them seemed to matter. The atmosphere grew stranger with each session. During experimental recordings, Yoko would interrupt with suggestions about tone or rhythm. Ringo was stunned not by Yoko's boldness, but by John's reaction to it. Instead of defending his bandmates, John sided with her instantly. He once looked at Ringo and said bluntly, "Just keep it even, that's enough." To a drummer already carrying the stigma of being the least talented, the message cut deep. Your opinion ends where her opinion begins. Tension escalated each time someone questioned Yoko's presence. George Harrison once snapped in frustration, and John exploded, slamming a table and accusing the others of disrespect. It wasn't about music anymore. It was about loyalty, and John's loyalty had shifted. For a man like Ringo, who valued peace, the emotional cost was enormous. In his eyes, the Beatles were losing their leader because an all-consuming relationship that left no oxygen for anyone else. He even acknowledged later that the band was already drifting apart. And in a rare, heartbreaking memory, Ringo described visiting John in New York in 1980. The laughter, the ease, the sense that they were still brothers. Weeks later, John was assassinated. Their hatred never had the chance to be resolved. It vanished before they could face it. Alan Klein, the outsider who turned the Beatles into enemies. The arrival of Alan Klein didn't feel dramatic at first. It felt like relief. With Brian Epstein gone and Apple Corps bleeding money, the Beatles were drowning in chaos. They were global icons who couldn't balance their own books. Ringo, tired of polished executives who spoke politely but achieved nothing, found Klein refreshing, blunt, aggressive, willing to fight. A man who promised to protect them. John was the first to embrace him. George quickly followed, and Ringo, wanting stability more than anything, signed on with them. He later explained what appealed to him. Klein was a hustler, and I felt it was time I had someone hustling for me. But behind the charm was a strategist who knew exactly how to weaponize loyalty. Klein studied the fractures inside the group. Paul's need for control, John's restlessness, George's resentment, and Ringo's desire for peace. Then he exploited them. Meetings that were once arguments became battlegrounds. Decisions that were once unanimous became 3 versus 1. Within months, Klein had turned the internal tension into a full-scale rupture. Paul refused to sign a contract with him. Klein encouraged John, George, and Ringo to move forward anyway. Later, Paul sued the other 3 Beatles and Klein in 1970. The lawsuit destroyed whatever friendship remained. Every wound between Ringo and the others deepened. Distrust, resentment, regret. The brotherhood was shattered not only by egos, but by signatures and courtrooms. Then came the cruel twist. By 1973, Ringo realized the man he trusted had mismanaged funds, manipulated contracts, and used the Beatles for leverage, Klein was fired. Investigations followed. The three who once sided with him, including Ringo, admitted they were wrong. Alan Steckler later revealed something devastating George once said. "The only way the Beatles can ever get together again is if Alan isn't there. I'm ready. So is Ringo." That confession shows everything. For Ringo, Klein represented the deepest betrayal of all. The man he trusted to protect them became the man who ensured they would never stand on a stage together again. The truth about Ringo Starr's real talent and legacy. When the dust from Alan Klein finally settled, Ringo was left facing a brutal question. Was he really the least talented Beatle, like everyone said? For years he'd heard the jokes. The drummer who got lucky, the man carried by Lennon and McCartney. And after the breakup, those words echoed even louder because there was no band left to hide behind. But time exposed the truth the critics never saw. The same sessions where Paul grabbed his drum seat and John dismissed him were also the sessions where producers realized he was the only Beatle who almost never drifted off tempo. George Martin, who once replaced him on Love Me Do, later admitted Ringo wasn't just reliable, he was the click track, the human anchor holding the band together. And when younger drummers studied his parts, they discovered they couldn't copy his feel. As the years moved on, the narrative flipped. His solo career produced real hits, and giants like Harrison, Clapton, Dylan, and Elton John kept calling him back because his groove lifted their music, not because of nostalgia. Even Paul, the same man who once corrected his drumming, ended up inducting him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. Today, his legacy isn't luck or simplicity. It's precision, feel, and endurance. He wasn't the least talented Beatle. He was the heartbeat, the steady foundation that let the other three soar. And the longer time passes, the clearer it becomes. Ringo Starr wasn't the band's weakest link. He was the piece no one realized they needed until he proved it for half a century. So now that you've seen the full picture, who do you think Ringo resented the most in his heart? Paul, John, or Alan Klein? Tell me in the comments whose role in this story shocked you the most and why. And if you want more brutally honest, behind-the-scenes stories like this about rock legends, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. There are a lot more secrets still hiding behind those smiling faces.